4, 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is Judy from Bungalow Quilting and Yarn, here to show you the scrap template system for making scrap quilts. This is a series of a 3.5, a 4.5, and a 5.5 inch block. And the beauty of the product is that it's not a complicated ruler. It's specifically made for people who have tubs and tubs of uneven scraps that don't lend themselves to cutting into strips. It's specifically designed for all of us who have these large Rubbermaid tubs where the scraps don't match and they're odd shaped. So what I started out doing was I started cutting everything up into 3.5 inch squares. Now here are my 3.5 inch squares. You can see how widely diverse these scraps are from all ends of the color spectrum. My 3.5 inch squares I wanted to do in a crossroads quilt. The crossroads quilt unfortunately requires setting triangles. And the setting triangles are here and here, and I did not want to have to do the math. There are formulas that require you to add 5/8 inch and 7/8 inch, and that's oftentimes too hard for people to figure out. So what I decided to do was cut these 3.5 inch squares, and then I was going to take a 4.5 inch square and a 5.5 inch square and bisect them twice, okay? So if it worked, great. If it didn't, I hadn't lost anything. Well, not only did it work, but these are quarters of the 5.5, and these are quarters of the 4.5, okay? And because this is a little bit longer than you would typically use for a 3.5 inch size block for a setting triangle, we've got a little extra room in our margins so that we actually make our 1/4 inch seam. We're not cutting off any of our points. So now that worked very well, and I got a whole bunch of scraps used up, but the problem was that purchasing a 3.5 inch and a 4.5 inch square independently, you're up over $20. I couldn't find a 5.5 inch square because it's not made commercially, so I had to have someone make it for me out of plexiglass. So now I was up over $30. Feeling that I had spent a lot of money, I needed to use them again. So back to the scraps in the tub, I went back and started cutting them up into 5.5 inch squares. Now the base of this house is a 5.5 inch square. The rooftops are half of the 4.5, and the backgrounds are halves of the 3.5. Again, because the 3.5 inch half square is slightly too long for that 4.5 inch edge, you're going to make a nice crisp point where your rooftops are. When you make your 1/4 inch seam, you don't cut off any of those tops. So again, I used a whole bunch of fabric, a wide variety, where you would not expect to find something like this next to this and have it work, but yet it works out very beautifully. So the next one that I decided to do using just those sizes was this one here. This one is one that you can get done in a very quick period of time because you're only dividing your scraps out into 3 colorways, brown, pink, and green, all right? And then you're organizing them in lights and darks. Now you could use any 3 colorways that you want and just organize them into lights and darks. The thing that makes it so simple is that when you pick out your scraps from those tubs, all they have to do is be large enough to accommodate the 5.5 inch square. You have to have 2 darks and 2 lights, and you're going to iron them out nice and flat. And then you're going to layer them. And then you take the 5.5 inch square, you put it down, and with a sharp rotary blade, you're going to cut around all 4 sides. There are just a minimal number of cuts that you need to make to turn out that entire quilt. So you take the 5.5 one off, you put the 3.5 back on, cut right to the edge and you stop, cut right to the edge and you stop. I have customers that tell me that they leave these 3 sizes of templates, this set, right on their cutting table because they know they're going to have a really good plan for what they're going to do with all those scraps when they finish a project. Okay, so now these are all the cuts that you're going to have to make. So now you've cut a 3.5 inch square and you alternate your lights and your darks. So you're alternating your lights and your darks. So one night you're spending ironing and cutting, and the next night you're going to spend chain piecing. And that's why this gets done so very quickly. You don't want to waste thread. So you're going to chain piece this to this, this to this, this to this, and this to this. Okay, now because I made a 1/4 inch seam, this gets shortened up by just a little bit, so that when you add this rectangle, all you're doing is cutting that tiny little bit off. That's the only trimming and the only wasting. It's not a complicated ruler system. It's not something that you're going to go home and wish you hadn't bought because you can't remember how to use it. It's simply a system of 3 squares. And because it's just 3 squares, you can make all these quilts without any difficulty at all remembering how to use it. Now that's the one that I showed you right back here. This unit right here is done very similarly. This unit here is done very much like this. These are quarters of the 5.5 and these are quarters of the 4.5. Look at the margins. Look how wide those margins are. It's great for beginners because when you go to make that 1/4 inch seam, you're not going to cut off any points. And this is the quilt that you can do, putting all of those together. It's crowns. So you could use it as a baby quilt, do it in pinks and blues, or doing it in lots of different colors makes it very cheerful and bright. Now another one that you can do is square and a square. This is called Dutchman's Puzzle actually in the book, because this is a 5.5 inch square. These are halves of the 4.5, and these are halves of the 4.5, okay? Now watch what happens when you alternate your lights and your darks on those outside 4.5 inch squares, half squares. You get rotation in your block, and when you put a whole bunch of those together, every other block is a pinwheel block. See that? Nice crisp pinwheel, secondary design without even trying to make a secondary design. Not cutting off any points, only using scraps, odd shaped scraps, ones that you would not normally think would go together, and they went together beautifully. Now the one up there in the corner, I sewed many, many garments for many years for little girls. And I started cutting them all up into 5.5 inch squares. And then I cut some of them in 3.5 inch squares. You take the 5.5 inch square, you put the 3.5 inch squares in the corner. You sew on the diagonal and flip it up. Do the same thing in this corner. This is just the old-fashioned autograph block. When you put 4 of those old-fashioned autograph blocks together, you can turn them and get X's and O's. So it's hugs and kisses. And the very last one over here, this one I divided into colorways. Purple, orange, blue, and green, and red. Cut them all up into 5.5 inch squares. This right here is half of the 5.5. These are quarters of the 4.5. Okay? The other half of that, you're not going to throw it away. You're going to take the other half of it, fold it in half. So this one gets folded, the other half of this gets folded up, opened out. You have a crease here. You put the diagonal line on that crease, and you're going to cut there, and that yields that square. That's just the old-fashioned Jacob's ladder block. That's all it is. These are all done with odd-shaped scraps from Rubbermaid tubs. You've got tubs and tubs of those scraps. You need to find a way to use them up. This is the perfect way to use them up. You can order the 3.5, 4.5, and 5.5 inch template on my website. The book goes with it. The book and the templates together are $20. The book has black and white photos. You can refer to this video as many times as you want to learn how to use them. Thank you for watching, and I hope you pick up the 3.5, 4.5, and 5.5 inch template for your scraps.